You know that thing you do every single day without even noticing it? You look up, just for a second, and there it is, the sun, same as it was yesterday, same as it'll be tomorrow, except it's not. Because for the entire history of humanity, there's been a part of the sun no human eye, no telescope, no camera has ever truly seen. Not because it's hidden, it's the opposite. It's too bright, too close, too violent. It's called the inner corona, and until a few weeks ago, it was one of the last places in our own solar system we simply couldn't look at directly. People built temples for the sun, died worshiping it, painted it on cave walls 10,000 years before writing existed. And still, this one piece of it stayed just out of reach until now, because someone finally found a way to see it. And what's inside isn't what anyone expected. So let's talk about what the corona actually is. Because most people think the sun is just the ball, the bright circle, the thing that ends where the light seems to stop. But that's not where the sun ends, not even close. The corona is the sun's outer atmosphere. It stretches millions of miles past the visible surface, past what we casually call the sun, into space, thinning out slowly until it just becomes the solar wind, drifting all the way to us, all the way past us, brushing against every planet in this system. And here's the part that still doesn't make sense, even to the people who've spent their whole careers studying it. The surface of the sun, the part you'd get close to if you could survive it, sits at around 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot, obviously. Unimaginable, but at least it follows a kind of logic. The deeper you go into a fire, the hotter it gets. The closer you are to the source, the more it burns. Except the corona breaks that rule completely. Because the corona, this outer layer, further from the sun's engine, further from wherever all that heat is supposedly coming from, is not cooler. It's hundreds of times hotter. We're talking over 1,000,000 degrees. Some parts several million, further from the fire. Hotter than the fire. For decades, that single fact has had physicists quietly losing their minds. They call it the coronal heating problem, like it's just some line item to sort out. But really, it's one of those questions that, if you actually sit with it, should make you feel a little dizzy, because it means something out there is generating more energy the farther it gets from its source. And nobody has ever fully explained why. Now here's where it gets personal, in a strange way. Think about how rarely we ever get to see this thing at all. Not the corona in general. Eclipse chasers have caught glimpses of the outer parts of it for centuries, when the moon slides in front of the sun just right and blocks out that blinding face for a few minutes. That's old. That's been documented since ancient civilizations stood in fields, terrified, watching daylight disappear. But the inner corona, the part closest to the surface, the most violent, the most active layer, where all that unexplained heat and energy is happening in real time, that part has stayed hidden. Even during a total eclipse, even with the moon doing exactly what it needs to do, the inner corona is still too faint, too close to the glare, too easily drowned out by the sun's own light bleeding into the shot. It's like trying to hear someone whisper standing 3 feet from a jet engine. So for as long as we've been looking up, this one region, arguably the most important one, the one that might actually explain why the sun behaves the way it does, has basically been off limits. Scientists have built instruments called coronagraphs, devices that essentially create an artificial eclipse, blocking the sun's disk so the fainter light around it can finally show itself. And even those, for a long time, weren't good enough. They still had to block out too much. The inner corona kept slipping through the cracks, right at the edge of what our tools could resolve, until someone finally built something precise enough to stop hiding it. And I think that's the part that gets me, honestly. Not just the science of it, though the science is wild, but the idea that something can be right there every single day, the whole time, and still take us this long to actually see it clearly. Isn't that kind of how a lot of things work? The thing hiding in plain sight isn't always hiding because it's far away. Sometimes it's hiding because it's too close, too bright, too overwhelming to look at directly without the right kind of filter, the right kind of distance, the right kind of patience. We spent thousands of years staring at the sun, worshiping it, fearing it, painting it, writing about it. And there was still a version of it we'd never actually seen. Not because it wasn't there, because we hadn't figured out how to look yet. So how did they actually do it? How do you finally see something that's been too bright to see for the entire span of human history? The answer starts with a spacecraft most people have never heard of, doing one of the most extreme things any machine has ever done. It's called the Parker Solar Probe, and its entire mission, from the very beginning, was ridiculous on paper. Fly closer to the sun than anything humans have ever built. Not orbit it from a safe distance the way satellites circle Earth. Get close, dangerously close. Close enough that engineers had to build an entire heat shield just so the instruments behind it could survive. We're talking about a spacecraft that, at its closest approach, gets nearer to the sun than Mercury ever does. Closer than any planet in our solar system. It moves at speeds that are honestly hard to picture. Over 400,000 miles per hour at points, fast enough to cross the distance between New York and Tokyo in under a minute. And the whole time, one side of that spacecraft is facing temperatures close to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt most metals. Hot enough that the heat shield itself had to be built from a specific carbon composite, engineered to basically shrug off heat that would destroy almost anything else we've ever sent into space. Meanwhile, just a few feet behind that shield, the instruments stay at something close to room temperature. Let that sit for a second. A few feet of distance is the difference between an inferno and something you could comfortably work next to. That's not an accident. That's not luck. That's years of people sitting in rooms, running numbers, failing, redoing the numbers, because they were trying to build something that could survive getting closer to a star than anything ever had. And they did it on purpose. Not to just get close for the sake of being close. They did it because the only way to actually understand the corona, really understand it, not just theorize about it from 93 million miles away, was to go there, to fly through it, to let the instrument sit inside that superheated, chaotic atmosphere and just listen. Because here's something people don't always realize. The corona isn't calm. It's not some smooth, glowing halo just sitting quietly around the sun. It's violent. There are magnetic field lines out there that snap and reconnect with so much force they release energy equivalent to millions of hydrogen bombs, all in a fraction of a second. There are streams of particles being flung outward so fast they eventually become what we call the solar wind. The same wind that, when it reaches Earth, causes the auroras. The same wind that, if it's strong enough, can knock out satellites, mess with power grids, disrupt communication systems we quietly depend on every day without thinking about it. All of that starts here, in this region we could barely see. So Parker Solar Probe didn't just take a picture from far away and zoom in. It flew directly into the middle of that chaos, again and again, orbit after orbit, gathering data no one had ever been able to gather before because no one had ever survived being close enough to gather it. And even then, even flying that close, actually capturing a clear image of the inner corona required something else. A special kind of camera on board, called Whisper, built specifically to see faint light in the middle of overwhelming brightness. Because remember the problem from before. The inner corona isn't dim, it's just drowned out. Like trying to see the stars at noon. Whisper had to be sensitive enough to catch that faint structure, without getting completely blown out by the light surrounding it. And on one of Parker's closest approaches yet, it finally did. For the first time in the history of our species, a camera captured a clear, detailed view of the sun's inner corona. Not a blurry hint, not a mathematical model dressed up as an image. An actual photograph of a place no human being has ever laid eyes on directly. I keep coming back to that word. First. Not first this year. Not first with this specific instrument. First, period. First since humans existed. First since anyone stood outside and looked up and wondered what was actually happening up there, past the point where our eyes gave out. There's something almost strange about that, if you really think about it. We've mapped the ocean floor. We've sent rovers walking across another planet. We've split atoms and sequenced entire genomes and built machines that can fold proteins in seconds. And this whole time, there was a layer of our own sun, the star we orbit, the one thing every living creature on Earth depends on completely, that we had simply never seen. Not because we didn't care, not because we weren't trying, because it took us this long to build something brave enough and precise enough to get close enough to look. Now let's actually look at what's in that photograph, because it's not just a milestone, it's not just first image ever. What's inside it is genuinely strange, in a way that's hard to explain unless you understand what scientists expected to see versus what actually showed up. For years, when researchers modeled the corona from a distance, they pictured something relatively smooth. Streamers, sure, those wispy, feathered structures that reach outward from the sun during an eclipse, the ones people photograph and post with captions like "Nature's Crown." Beautiful, but in the models, mostly orderly. Predictable, in the way weather patterns are predictable, even when they're dramatic. What Parker's solar probe actually captured was something closer to chaos organizing itself in real time. Structures twisting. Loops of plasma rising and collapsing back on themselves within minutes. Streams of material braiding together and then tearing apart like threads pulled too tight until they snap. Places where the magnetic field wasn't just guiding the plasma gently, it was fighting it, wrestling with it, losing in some places and winning in others. And you can actually see the outcome of that fight frozen in a single frame. It's the kind of image that, if you didn't know better, you'd assume was a piece of art. Something a person designed on purpose, layering movement and tension into a single frozen moment. Except nobody designed this. Nobody could have. This is just what happens. Constantly, above the surface of the thing that lights up your mornings and keeps every living thing on this planet from freezing into stillness. And here's where I think it stops being just a science story and starts being something else. Because we live our whole lives assuming the version of things we're shown. The surface. The smooth explanation. The calm photo. We build entire understandings of people, of situations, of ourselves, based on what's visible from a safe distance. The version that doesn't require us to fly directly into the mess and sit inside it long enough to actually see what's happening. The sun's surface is loud, obviously. It's bright, it's active, it's the part everyone already respects. But it was never the whole story. The real turbulence, the part that actually explains why the whole system behaves the way it does, was happening one layer deeper, in the part nobody could get close enough to witness. I think about that a lot, actually. How the most honest version of almost anything is usually not the first layer. It's the one just past it. The one that requires you to get uncomfortably close before it even starts making sense. Scientists are already saying this data might finally help crack that coronal heating mystery I mentioned earlier. That strange rule-breaking fact where the corona, farther from the sun's core, somehow runs hotter than the surface itself. Some of the new footage shows what look like tiny rapid bursts of energy, sometimes called nanoflares, sparking constantly across the corona. Small individually. But if there are enough of them, happening often enough, all across that layer, they might add up to exactly the kind of relentless heating that's been unexplained for decades. Nobody's calling it solved. Not yet. Researchers are careful people, and rightly so. This is one image, one especially close pass, one piece of a much bigger, ongoing investigation. but it's the closest anyone has come to an actual answer, because for the first time they're not just modeling this activity from 93 million miles away. They're watching it happen from inside it, and maybe that's the part worth sitting with for a second. We spent so long trying to understand the sun by staring at it from a safe distance, measuring its light, studying its shadow during eclipses, building elaborate equations to guess at what must be happening somewhere we couldn't reach. And all of that mattered. None of it was wasted. But it took actually going there, getting close enough to risk being destroyed by the thing we were trying to understand before the real picture started to come into focus. There's a version of that in almost anything worth understanding. Honestly, the theories, the guesses, the distant observations, they get you part way. They give you a shape, an outline, a reasonable idea of what's probably going on. But there's always a point where you either keep observing from a comfortable distance, or you build something strong enough to survive getting closer, and you go. Parker Solar Probe chose to go, and what it found wasn't a cleaner, tidier version of what we expected. It was messier, more alive, more violent and more intricate than any model had captured, which, if you think about it, tends to be true of most things once you actually get close enough to see them clearly. The sun didn't get simpler the closer we got to it. It got more real. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when people cover this story. It's not just what Parker Solar Probe saw. It's what it survived to see it. Because before any of this data existed, before that image of the inner corona was even possible, engineers had to solve a problem that honestly sounds almost impossible when you say it out loud. How do you build something that can fly through an environment hot enough to vaporize steel and still keep the instruments inside it cool enough to function? The heat shield they built is called the thermal protection system, just 8 feet across, about 4.5 inches thick, and on the sun-facing side it's coated with a specialized white ceramic paint, designed specifically to reflect as much of that radiation as possible before it even has the chance to soak in. Behind that shield sits a core made of carbon composite foam, the same basic family of material used in some high-performance aerospace parts, but pushed to an extreme most engineering teams never have to consider. It's sandwiched between two panels of carbon-carbon composite, a material so heat-resistant it's used on things like the nose cone of spacecraft re-entering Earth's atmosphere, where friction alone can turn the outer surface into something close to fire. And still, even with all of that, the front of the shield reaches temperatures the design team measured near 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit during the closest approaches. Now here's the number that actually gets me every time I think about it. A few feet behind that shield, not miles, not even yards, just a few feet, the spacecraft's instruments sit comfortably around room temperature, somewhere close to 85 degrees. 2,500 degrees on one side. 85 degrees a few feet away. That gap isn't an accident of good luck. It's not a rough estimate that happened to work out. Every single inch of that spacecraft was calculated, tested, and retested by people who understood that if they were off by even a small margin, there was no rescue mission, no repair crew, no second chance. Whatever they built had to work exactly right, the very first time it flew through conditions no spacecraft had ever survived, because it was going somewhere no spacecraft had ever gone. And I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because it says something about what it actually takes to see something new. It's easy to talk about discovery like it's a single dramatic moment, the photo, the headline, the first time in history line that makes people stop scrolling. But that moment is always sitting on top of something much less glamorous. Years of failed prototypes. Rooms full of engineers arguing over fractions of an inch. Tests that didn't work. Materials that cracked under conditions they were supposed to survive. Timelines pushed back because close enough wasn't going to cut it when the cost of being wrong was total silent failure 93 million miles from anyone who could help. Nobody was there to fix it in real time. Whatever went up had to already be right. There's something almost humbling about that, especially next to how effortless the actual photograph looks once it's finally released to the public. You see the image, you read the headline, and it feels instant, clean, almost simple in the way finished things always look simpler than they were to build. But nothing about this was simple. Every part of it, the heat shield, the orbit path, the exact sequence of gravity assists using Venus to slowly tighten the spacecraft's loop around the sun over years, not days. Every part of it existed because a group of people refused to accept "we can't get close enough" as a final answer. They just kept getting closer. A little more each pass, learning what the spacecraft could handle, learning what the sun would allow, adjusting, testing, tightening the orbit bit by bit, mission after mission, until eventually they were close enough, actually physically close enough, for a camera on board to finally catch what generations of scientists before them could only guess at from a distance. I don't think that's just a story about engineering. I think it's a story about what it actually costs to get near the truth of something. Not the surface version, not the safe, distant theory. The real, messy, dangerous version that only shows itself once you're willing to build something strong enough to survive standing that close to it. Most of us do this on a smaller scale, all the time, without a heat shield or a spacecraft. There are versions of our own lives, our own choices, our own patterns, the things we keep circling back to, that we understand only from a safe distance. We form theories about ourselves, models, reasonable guesses based on what we can observe from far away, because getting closer feels like it might cost too much, might burn too hot. There's a detail from this mission that most articles skip over, because it doesn't sound as dramatic as closest spacecraft to the sun in history. But I think it might be the most human part of the whole story. The spacecraft is named after a man named Eugene Parker, and back in 1958, decades before anyone had the technology to prove it, he published a theory that most of the scientific community at the time thought was frankly ridiculous. He proposed that the sun wasn't just quietly sitting there, radiating light and heat outwards in a calm, predictable way. He argued that it was constantly releasing a steady stream of charged particles into space, what we now call the solar wind, and that this stream was powerful enough to shape the entire structure of the solar system around it. At the time, this idea was rejected, not gently either. One of the most prominent scientific journals of the era refused to publish his paper. A reviewer dismissed the whole concept outright. Parker was, in some circles, treated less like a scientist making a bold claim and more like someone who'd wandered off from established, respectable physics into something closer to speculation. He kept the theory anyway, not out of stubbornness for its own sake, because the math worked, because when he ran the numbers over and over, the only conclusion that made sense was the one nobody wanted to accept yet. It took years of satellite data, gathered slowly, mission by mission, before the wider scientific community finally admitted he'd been right. The solar wind is real. It's constant. It's the reason comet tails always point away from the sun, no matter which direction the comet is traveling. It's the reason Earth's auroras exist at all. An entire invisible force shaping the space around us, exactly the way one person insisted it did, back when almost nobody believed him. So when NASA decided to name a spacecraft after him, the first spacecraft ever named after a living person, which is its own quiet kind of honor, it wasn't just a nice gesture. It was almost poetic in a way that feels too neat to be a coincidence. The man who spent his career studying something invisible, something most people couldn't be convinced was even there, lived long enough to watch a machine bearing his name fly directly into the middle of it, close enough to finally prove, beyond any argument, that he'd been right the whole time. He passed away in 2022, a couple of years after the probe launched. He got to see it fly. He got to see some of the early data come back. He didn't live to see this particular image, the inner corona, captured clearly for the first time. But everything that made that image possible traces directly back to a theory he refused to abandon when the entire field told him he was wrong. I keep thinking about how long that gap was. Decades between the idea and the proof. Decades of that theory just sitting there, technically unconfirmed, technically dismissed by people whose job it was to know better. And it makes me wonder how many other ideas are sitting in that same place right now. Not proven wrong, just not provable yet. Waiting on something, a tool, a spacecraft, a shift in what we're capable of building, before anyone can finally confirm what one person already quietly knew. There's a strange kind of patience required for that. Not the performative kind, where someone insists they'll be vindicated one day and makes a whole identity out of waiting. The quieter kind, where you do the work, you trust the math, you keep publishing and refining and defending an idea because it's true, whether or not the room is ready to hear it yet. Parker didn't get to see this image, but everything in it exists because he was right about something invisible, decades before anyone built a machine that could prove it. And now, that same invisible thing, the wind he described in a paper nobody wanted to publish, is being watched in real time, tearing and twisting and reshaping itself in the footage his spacecraft brought home. Sometimes being right just means waiting long enough for the right tool to finally show up. So where does all of this actually leave us? Now that we've seen it, now that a camera has finally captured the part of the sun that was too bright, too close, too dangerous to look at for the entire span of human history. If you've made it this far with me, genuinely, thank you for sticking around this long into something this deep. If this kind of thing does something for you, the way it does for me, consider subscribing and coming back tomorrow, because we do this every single day. And if there's a piece of this that hit you a certain way, drop it in the comments. I'd actually love to know, is there something in your life right now that you've only ever looked at from a safe distance? Something too bright, too close, too much to face directly, that you've been circling instead of flying into? Okay, back to the sun, because here's the part that actually matters most now that the image exists. This isn't the end of the story. It's the opening of a much bigger one. Parker's solar probe is still out there right now as you're listening to this, looping closer and closer with each pass, gathering more of this footage, more of this data, building toward an even fuller picture of what's actually happening in that violent, invisible layer above the sun's surface. Scientists are already comparing this new footage against decades of models, checking which theories hold up now that there's finally real evidence to test them against. The nanoflare theory, the magnetic reconnection patterns, the question of whether the corona's extreme heat comes from millions of tiny, constant explosions, or something else entirely that hasn't even been proposed yet. And there's something almost unsettling about that, if you sit with it. We just achieved something no human being has ever achieved. Direct visual proof of a place we could only theorize about for our entire existence as a species. And the honest answer from the people who study it is still, we don't fully know yet. We're closer, we're not finished. Which, if you think about it, is kind of the whole pattern of anything worth understanding. The moment you finally get close enough to see clearly doesn't hand you every answer. It just replaces one set of blurry guesses with a sharper, more detailed set of new questions. But there's a difference between a blurry question and a sharp one. A blurry question keeps you guessing forever, circling the same vague shape without ever really moving. A sharp question, the kind you only get once you're finally close enough to see the real texture of something, actually points somewhere. It gives you something to chase. That's what this image did. It didn't close the case on the sun's corona. It gave everyone studying it an actual, detailed map of where to look next. And maybe that's the real value of finally getting close to something you've only ever observed from a distance. Not that it hands you a clean, finished answer, but that it turns a vague mystery into a specific one you can actually work with, one you can actually chase. The sun's been burning for about 4.5 billion years. It'll keep burning for billions more. In the entire span of that time, this is the first moment, this exact stretch of years we happen to be alive for, where a piece of that fire finally became visible to the species standing beneath it. There's something I keep coming back to, out of everything we just walked through together. For thousands of years, people stood exactly where you're standing right now, under the same sun, feeling the same warmth on their skin. And they never once got to see this. Not because they weren't curious, not because they weren't brilliant in their own way with the tools they had. They built calendars around it, predicted eclipses down to the minute, centuries in advance, using nothing but patience and math and generations of careful observation passed down like inheritance. And still, this one layer stayed just out of reach. Too bright, too close, too much to look at directly. It took a theory nobody wanted to believe. A man who kept trusting his own math when an entire field told him he was wrong. A machine built to survive temperatures that would erase almost anything else we've ever sent into space. Years of tightening orbits, one careful pass at a time, inching closer to something that could have destroyed it in an instant, if even one calculation had been off. All of that just to finally see. And when they did, when the image finally came back, it wasn't calm. It wasn't the smooth, glowing halo people expected. It was tangled, twisting, loops rising and collapsing within minutes. Energy snapping and reforming in ways that still don't fully make sense, even to the people who've spent their lives studying it. Turns out the truth, once you actually get close enough to see it, is rarely the tidy version. I think that's the part worth carrying with you, longer than any of the numbers, longer than the heat shield specs or the orbit paths or the exact temperature difference across a few feet of spacecraft. Not the sun, the distance. How much of what we think we understand, about anything really, is just the version we've been observing from far away. The safe read, the theory that lets us keep our hands off the fire. And how the real shape of something almost never reveals itself from there. It waits, quietly the way the inner corona waited, not hiding, just too much to face without the right kind of shield, the right kind of orbit, the right kind of patience built up slowly, pass after pass, until finally, you're close enough. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that. You already know if there's something in your own life sitting exactly where the corona used to sit. Something you've circled from a distance for a long time, theorized about, guessed at, decided you already understood without ever actually flying close enough to see it clearly. Maybe you do. Maybe you don't. Either way, that's yours to sit with, not mine to explain. If this one found you at the right moment, do me a favor. Subscribe so you don't miss what we dig into next. And if you know 5 people who'd sit through something like this with you, actually send it to them. Not just like it. Send it. And before you go, leave an honest comment. Not just great video. Tell me something real. What part of this actually stuck with you, and what's the next thing you're curious about? What's the next question you want me to chase down for you? Because somewhere out there, right now, there's probably another version of the inner corona. Something we've been staring at for centuries. Something too bright, too close, too obvious to have actually understood yet. We just haven't built the thing strong enough to get close to it. Not yet.